Okay, good evening. We're going to start. I want to start on time because we have a lot of material for tonight's class. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to start tonight's class with not my own words, but a YouTube clip from a congressional hearing on the issue of reparations. Tonight's class is going to be all about the issue of reparations. The overall series, we're going to have probably about 4 classes. I've titled it A Jewish Approach to the Current Racial and Civil Discord. I tried to come up with a title that wouldn't upset anyone. I didn't want anyone upset even before we started the class. I don't know if I did accomplish that or not, but that's the title. And we're going to go through a number of topics throughout the next few weeks. Tonight, we're going to talk about reparations from a perspective of Jewish law, of Jewish thought. We're going to talk about the role of policing. We're going to talk about the role of protest. What does halacha, what does Judaism say? Basically, everything that you see in the news, everything that's happening all the time, or maybe some of you are actually participating in. The question is, what does Judaism have to say about this? It's a very important belief that I have, that when we are reading the news and we're having questions about things, almost everything that we are feeling or wondering about, we can turn to our sources. I don't think that we can turn to our sources and get very specific answers. We're not going to get like, oh, here's the line from the Shulchan Aruch that tells us whether we should support this or that movement. You're not going to have that, obviously. But I believe that by going through the sources and sort of allowing the sources to be the frame or the lens through which we see things, that's what it means to do Judaism. All right. In other words, it's not necessarily about the answer. I'm sure that there are people on this Zoom room right now from opposite sides of every single question that we're going to talk about. Not only am I sure, knowing you, I know there are people on exact opposite sides of all of the questions that I'm going to address tonight. I just know that. And I know that everybody can go and cherry pick their sources from the text. So it's not about proving from a Jewish source what we should do or what we shouldn't do. I do think that there are certain overarching values that we can get from the text, but I don't believe that we're going to find like a specific line that will tell us what or how to act. It's more about the process of going through the text, of trying to understand them, trying to filter them through our Jewish lens, our Jewish eyes, our Jewish hearts, our Jewish minds, and being able to then kind of formulate our ideas in that way. So as I said, tonight we're going to talk about reparations. Now, I have a few caveats about this whole series, certain hesitations or concerns. One of them is that one of the major topics is going to be racism and the role of racism in the country. And obviously, I am not Black. I'm not a Black person. I don't have the experience of growing up being a Black person in America. I don't, honestly, and I think this is one of our big challenges, I don't even have a lot of friends or acquaintances who are African American. It's a very big challenge in terms of part of our country, which I think is extremely divided in that way. But it's obviously important for me to bring in voices of African Americans and what they actually say. It's not so easy, you know, who am I going to get to come in? And also, the point of the class is not really to hear other voices. The point is I'm going to take a look at different Jewish sources and give an approach or some insight from our text on what we can or start thinking about certain issues. But even though that's the case, I definitely still wanted to highlight different voices. So in order to start the question of reparations, I'm going to actually share my screen. I hope I can do this. And okay, here we go. Wait 1 second. I have to make sure that I have that I shared it with the volume as well. Hold on 1 second. Share computer sound. Okay, good. That would not have worked. Okay, so this is, as I mentioned, this is from a congressional hearing. This is going to be Ta-Nehisi Coates, and he's going to be the first speaker. He's going to speak in favor of reparations. And then the second speaker will be someone named Coleman Hughes. He also testified at this hearing. I think it happened about a year ago, because there's a bill called HR 40, which is basically a bill that all of it doesn't actually say that there should be reparations. It just says that the Congress should set up a commission to study whether or not there should be reparations. And even that is very controversial and has never been, I don't think it's gotten more than 40 or 50 votes in favor of it. But anyways, this is the hearing that just happened this past year. Reparations was in the news a lot during the elections. Many of the Democratic candidates for president did support reparations. So here is 10 minutes. I'm sorry, it's pretty long, but I want us to hear their voices on pros and cons for reparations. The first voice, Ta-Nehisi Coates, is in favor of reparations. In fact, he wrote a very important article from The Atlantic in like 2013 or 2014 about it. And then the second voice will be Coleman Hughes. So let me know, just give me a thumbs up if you can hear.
Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell offered a familiar reply. America should not be held liable for something that happened 150 years ago, since none of us currently alive are responsible. This rebuttal proffers a strange theory of governance, that American accounts are somehow bound by the lifetime of its generations. But well into this century, the United States was still paying out pensions to the heirs of Civil War soldiers. We honor treaties that date back some 200 years, despite no one being alive who signed those treaties. Many of us would love to be taxed for the things we are solely and individually responsible for. But we are American citizens, and thus bound to a collective enterprise that extends beyond our individual and personal reach. It would seem ridiculous to dispute invocations of the founders or the greatest generation on the basis of a lack of membership in either group. We recognize our lineage as a generational trust, as inheritance. And the real dilemma posed by reparations is just that, a dilemma of inheritance. It is impossible to imagine America without the inheritance of slavery. As historian Ed Baptist has written, enslavement, quote, shaped every crucial aspect of the economy and politics of America, so that by 1836, more than 600 million, or almost half of the economic activity in the United States, derived directly or indirectly from the cotton produced by the million-odd slaves. By the time the enslaved were emancipated, they comprised the largest single asset in America, $3 billion in 1860 dollars, more than all the other assets in the country combined. The method of cultivating this asset was neither gentle cajoling nor persuasion, but torture, rape, and child trafficking. Enslavement reigned for 250 years on these shores. When it ended, this country could have extended its hallowed principles, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness to all, regardless of color. But America had other principles in mind. And so for a century after the Civil War, Black people were subjected to a relentless campaign of terror, a campaign that extended well into the lifetime of Majority Leader McConnell. It is tempting to divorce this modern campaign of terror, of plunder, from enslavement. But the logic of enslavement, of white supremacy, respects no such borders. And the god of bondage was lustful and begat many heirs: coup d'etats and convict leasing, vagrancy laws and debt peonage, redlining and racist GI bills, poll taxes and state-sponsored terrorism. We grant that Mr. McConnell was not alive for Appomattox, but he was alive for the electrocution of George Stinney. He was alive for the blinding of Isaac Woodward. He was alive to witness kleptocracy in his native Alabama and a regime premised on electoral theft. Majority Leader McConnell cited civil rights legislation yesterday, as well he should, because he was alive to witness the harassment, jailing, and betrayal of those responsible for that legislation by a government sworn to protect them. He was alive for the redlining of Chicago and the looting of Black homeowners of some $4 billion. Victims of that plunder are very much alive today. I am sure they'd love a word with the Majority Leader. What they know, what this committee must know, is that while emancipation deadbolted the door against the bandits of America, Jim Crow wedged the windows wide open. And that is the thing about Senator McConnell's something. It was 150 years ago, and it was right now. The typical Black family in this country has 1/10 the wealth of the typical white family. Black women die in childbirth at 4 times the rate of white women. And there is, of course, the shame of this land of the free, boasting the largest prison population on the planet, of which the descendants of the enslaved make up the largest share. The matter of reparations is one of making amends and direct redress, but it is also a question of citizenship. In H.R. 40, this body has a chance to both make good on its 2009 apology for enslavement and reject fair-weather patriotism, to say that a nation is both its credits and its debits, that if Thomas Jefferson matters, so does Sally Hemings, that if D-Day matters, so does Black Wall Street, that if Valley Forge matters, so does Fort Pillow. Because the question really is not whether we will be tied to the somethings of our past, but whether we are courageous enough to be tied to the whole of them. Thank you.
Appreciate your attendance, and you're recognized for 5 minutes, sir.
Before we celebrate the freedom most Americans have, we must fight for the freedom all Americans deserve.
Thank you, Chairman Cohen, Ranking Member Johnson, and members of the committee. It's an honor to testify on a topic as important as this one. Nothing I'm about to say is meant to minimize the horror and brutality of slavery and Jim Crow. Racism is a bloody stain on this country's history, and I consider our failure to pay reparations directly to freed slaves after the Civil War to be one of the greatest injustices ever perpetrated by the US government. But I worry that our desire to fix the past compromises our ability to fix the present. Think about what we're doing today. We're spending our time debating a bill that mentions slavery 25 times, but incarceration only once, in an era with no black slaves, but nearly 1 million black prisoners. A bill that doesn't mention homicide once, at a time when the Center for Disease Control reports homicide as the #1 cause of death for young black men. I'm not saying that acknowledging history doesn't matter. It does. I'm saying there's a difference between acknowledging history and allowing history to distract us from the problems we face today. In 2008, the House of Representatives formally apologized for slavery and Jim Crow. In 2009, the Senate did the same. Black people don't need another apology. We need safer neighborhoods and better schools. We need a less punitive criminal justice system. We need affordable health care. And none of these things can be achieved through reparations for slavery. Nearly everyone close to me told me not to testify today. They told me that even though I've only ever voted for Democrats, I'd be perceived as a Republican and therefore hated by half the country. Others told me that by distancing myself from Republicans, I would end up angering the other half of the country. And the sad truth is that they were both right. That's how suspicious we've become of one another. That's how divided we are as a nation. If we were to pay reparations today, we would only divide the country further, making it harder to build the political coalitions required to solve the problems facing black people today. We would insult many black Americans by putting a price on the suffering of their ancestors. And we would turn the relationship between black Americans and white Americans from a coalition into a transaction, from a union between citizens into a lawsuit between plaintiffs and defendants. What we should do is pay reparations to black Americans who actually grew up under Jim Crow and were directly harmed by second-class citizenship, people like my grandparents. But paying reparations to all descendants of slaves is a mistake. Take me, for example. I was born 3 decades after the end of Jim Crow into a privileged household in the suburbs. I attend an Ivy League school. Yet I'm also descended from slaves who worked on Thomas Jefferson's Monticello plantation. So reparations for slavery would allocate federal resources to me, but not to an American with the wrong ancestry, even if that person is living paycheck to paycheck and working multiple jobs to support a family. You might call that justice. I call it justice for the dead at the price of justice for the living. I understand that reparations are about what people are owed, regardless of how well they're doing. I understand that. But the people who are owed for slavery are no longer here. and we're not entitled to collect on their debts. Reparations, by definition, are only given to victims. So the moment you give me reparations, you've made me into a victim without my consent. Not just that, you've made 1/3 of Black Americans who poll against reparations into victims without their consent. And Black Americans have fought too long for the right to define themselves, to be spoken for in such a condescending manner. The question is not what America owes me by virtue of my ancestry. The question is what all Americans owe each other by virtue of being citizens of the same nation. And the obligation of citizenship is not transactional. It's not contingent on ancestry. It never expires, and it can't be paid off. For all these reasons, Bill H.R. 40 is a moral and political mistake. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Hughes.
Oh, wait. Let me try to,
Chill. He was presumptive, but he still has a right to speak.
Okay. So I found myself listening to those. I listened to it a few times, you know, first listening to Ta-Nehisi Coates and like, wow, what a powerful argument. Obviously responding to Mitch McConnell, who basically had said that, you know, since the victims of slavery are no longer living, it doesn't, and the oppressors, the people who committed the sins are no longer alive, it doesn't make sense for Americans today to have to pay reparations, right? And Ta-Nehisi Coates is basically saying, yes, but it's not just about slavery, right? Slavery led to Jim Crow, which led to redlining, which led to a GI Bill that was racist, all the different things that we still are experiencing from. And basically that means that descendants of slaves today are still experiencing the legacy of slavery in very, very deep and profound ways. And therefore they are, in fact, entitled to reparations. He obviously had, you should read his article. His essay from The Atlantic is really very, very important to read. That I was reading that and I'm like, wow, that definitely makes a lot of sense. But then I also listened to Coleman Hughes, and I think that he also made a lot of good points. I mean, after all, what would reparations mean? Reparations would mean that someone like him, who grew up in an upper middle class family and is now at Harvard, he was an undergraduate at Harvard, I think he already graduated, but he was at that point, he would get reparations, right? I mean, by the way, the reparation numbers and the way that you figure out reparations, I've done a lot of research into this. It's very, very different. They're very different ideas, but one of the theories is that it should actually be a cash payment. And the way that you would basically figure it out is you look at the income gap, the wealth gap between people of color, between African Americans and whites, and you would then basically divide that number by all African Americans, figure out what that number would be. It's something like $12 trillion, and it basically could amount to, depending on how you figure it out, $100,000, $150,000 per descendant of slave, right? So obviously, in what sense, Coleman Hughes would say, does it make for me to get $150,000 right now as a graduate of Harvard, and that's it. Obviously, there are other models too. There's the model that Cory Booker is endorsing, the idea of the baby bonds. I'm sure you heard about this, which is basically an idea that every single person in America, every baby born in America would get a little trust fund. And depending on the income of the family, it would either be higher or lower. And then it would, of course, accrue interest over the years. And according to people who are advancing that particular theory, it would not be racially specific, meaning it would not only be for descendants of slavery, it would be for everybody. But the result of it is that it actually really would almost completely wipe out the disparities in terms of income between, or at least in terms of wealth between African Americans and whites. There are a lot of different theories out there. Obviously, there are arguments to be made on both sides. But what I want to do now is take a look at some of our Jewish sources and see what do the Jewish sources say about any of these issues, if anything. So I'm going to, first of all, open up the chat box. Feel free to put any comments in the chat box. I'll try to look at them, watch them, and address them as they come in. If you have a question that you really want to ask, feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question right in the middle of the lecture. But other than that, you can also put the comments into the chat. So I'm going to share my screen right now again. And this time I'm going to share my source sheet. Okay, there it is. Hold on one second. Okay, so here's our source sheet. Again, if you can give me a thumbs up if you can see the source sheet, I just want to make sure it's there. And I believe that my cursor is going over the actual text, so you should be able to see it. Okay, we're going to start with the first source. There are a number of places where I could have started, but I thought this was a very interesting text. Again, please keep in mind, no one text, you can't just look at a text and say, oh, from this text, we have a clear proof that we should have reparations or we shouldn't. It's really just sort of a lens to start thinking about these questions. So the pasuk is in Devarim chapter 15. It's actually in the context of a larger section talking about tzedakah, about helping out the widow and the orphan. And the pasuk says as follows: if a fellow Hebrew, now that needs to be noted that technically speaking, right here, we are actually talking about an Eved Ivri. In Judaism, of course, we have Eved Ivri and Eved Kanani. We have Jewish slaves and we have non-Jewish slaves. So the pasuk is actually talking about an Eved Ivri. So of course, one could right away say everything about these sources is only referring to Jews. It doesn't refer to non-Jews. But again, I'm trying to read these texts not as a direct proof, but really a way of thinking about what does it mean to have slaves? What does it mean for people to then have some sort of a reparation? Shad says in the comment, why aren't we going after Egypt for reparations? I don't know if that's a joke or not, but there's actually going to be a source from the Gemara that basically happens, where the Jews basically make the argument that Egypt owes them all the money. We're going to see a little bit further in the text. Hopefully we'll be able to get up to it tonight. But anyways, this pasuk is talking about what happens when you free your Eved Ivri, your slave. What happens when you free your slave? Your slave goes free. So it says, when you send them out, here's a very important line, lo tishalchenu rekam. Don't send the slave out empty-handed. They need to have something. Ha'aneg tanik lo, you should furnish him. That's how it's translated. You should give him, I'm going to focus in on that term in a second. Mitzoncha, from your flock. Migarnacha, from your threshing floor, from your vat. Asher beracha Hashem elokecha titin lo. Whatever Hashem has blessed you, you should give him. V'zacharta ki eved yisa b'eretz Hashem. You should remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and Hashem redeemed you from there. Therefore, I command you this thing on this day. Very, very interesting. So we have a halacha in the Torah that says that when your slave goes free, you must give him gifts. This is called the mitzvah of ha'anaka, right? From ha'anek ta'anik lo. You have to actually give the slave gifts. You cannot send them out empty-handed. This, by the way, is very reminiscent of after the slaves were set free. Originally, they were supposed to go out with what? The African Americans, what were they supposed to go out with? 40 acres and a mule. 40 acres and a mule. Unfortunately, President Andrew Johnson rescinded the order, and the slaves never received their 40 acres and a mule. It's a really interesting question to ponder. What would have happened if all of the slaves would have had their 40 acres and a mule, the freed slaves? Now, certainly there still would have been tons of racism over the last 150 years. But with all that land and the ability to actually start over again, it's very possible that a lot of the wealth inequalities would not happen. And actually, Coleman Hughes mentioned that. He said one of the greatest tragedies is that they didn't get the original reparations. The machloket, the debate seems to be, and as everyone seems to think that that's what should have happened back then. Of course, they should have gotten it. The question is, are we still going to do it right now, generations later, when no former slaves are alive? That's the question. But the idea of actually giving them something, this is very explicit in the Torah, and it becomes a very significant thing. Now, if you look, the last pasuk connects the mitzvah of ha'anaka, of giving gifts or giving reparations, if you will, to the slaves when they leave. It connects it to the fact that you were slaves in the land of Egypt. So what's this whole connection between the fact that you were slaves in the land of Egypt? And if you look at Rashi there, Rashi says, you have to remember, I'm just going to make my screen make it a little bit bigger so it's easier to read. I'm sure some of you are having a time. I'm having a hard time reading. Okay, so there you go. That might make it a little easier. So you have to remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and Hashem took you out. What's the connection? So Rashi says V'zacharti ki eved yisa, v'henakti v'shanisi lecha mibizas mitzrayim ubizas hayam. God says, look, I gave you reparations. You know, Chad asked, we should go after reparations, but guess what? We got reparations, big time. We got double reparations. When did we get double reparations? First of all, before we left Egypt, and we'll look at some of these sources, hopefully in about 10 minutes or so, or 15 minutes, on the way out, if you remember, Hashem said to the people, go and ask your Egyptian neighbors to either borrow or to get some gold and silver and all the things. And when they left Egypt, it says they emptied out Egypt. They took a lot of reparations on the way out. They were given it. The Egyptians said, and the pasuk says that Hashem gave the chen, Hashem gave the grace of the people in their eyes, and they gave us all this stuff on the way out. There was reparations that was right there. But what Rashi says is, it wasn't just reparations one time. We actually got double reparations, because in addition to getting things on the way out, what also happened? Then we left Egypt. We're running away. The Egyptians run after us. And what happens? We get to Yam Suf, Kriyas Yam Suf. We go through on dry land. The water comes back. The Egyptians drown in the sea. What happened on the shores of Yam Suf? All of their gold, all of their silver, all of their chariots, everything that they had came up, and the Jewish people got reparations, if you will, a second time. So basically what Hashem is saying, according to Rashi, in terms of this second pasuk being connected here, Hashem is basically saying, look, you got reparations when you left Egypt. I gave it to you twice. So when you have a slave who goes free, you have to give reparations as well. Now, again, we can ask, what are the ethics that actually allow, in the first place, us to have slaves? And that's a very, very challenging question. I'm not sure if I'm going to do a class on that. If you have a thought, if you're interested in that topic, let me know. The history of slavery within Judaism itself. It's not a contemporary question, because now all Jewish people will tell you they're opposed to slavery, of course. However, throughout Jewish history, there have been many, many Jewish thinkers who have been in favor of slavery. First of all, it was what everyone was doing. In fact, there's a very famous passage from the Rambam, where the Rambam is talking about how to run your Seder on Pesach night. And the Rambam says, what you should do is, when you say, you should say to your child, we were slaves in the land of Egypt. And then if you want to demonstrate to your child, what is a slave? He said, the Rambam says, you should point to the slave at your table who's serving you food, meaning they had slaves, and say, look, child, you were like this slave in Egypt. So I was talking about Maimonides, but Maimonides had no problem saying that, right? Obviously, it was 1,000 years, 900 years ago, but obviously there was slavery. And also, we know that there were sermons written by rabbis living in the South, by rabbis who were against abolition of slavery, and they wrote sermons based on halachic sources. There's a verse that says, "La'olam bohem ta'avodu," which is understood in traditional rabbinic understanding that if you have an Eved Kanani, if you have a Canaanite slave, it's actually halachically forbidden to free a Canaanite slave. So we have a lot of sources in Judaism which are quite troubling. It's not such a, we don't have such a clean history when it comes to slavery itself. Obviously, this is going back to the ancient world, medieval world, but perhaps maybe we'll do a session on slavery itself. But the point is, we definitely had slaves. There was slavery in the Torah, but what the Torah is saying is that when you free the slave, you obviously have to give him these reparations, if you will. Okay, now, another text, very, very interesting. Why? What is the function of reparations? Again, if we're trying to figure out whether or not we should still have reparations today, 150 years later, what would be the function of reparations? That might help us understand or at least evaluate whether or not we should have reparations today. So if you look in the source, Haktav HaKabbalah, this is actually Rabbi Yaakov Tzvi Mecklenburg, was a very important commentary on the Chumash from 19th century Germany. He says as follows, V'zacharti ki eved yisa, v'henakti v'shonisi lecha bizas mitzrayim bizas yam af atah ha'anek v'shina lo. Same thing as we said before, that, look, he's quoting Rashi that we just said before. There's this idea that, look, just like Hashem gave us reparations, we also have to give reparations to slaves when they leave us. But this is what he adds. L'fizet tzrichim lefarish milas v'yiftacha shenasan lecha pidyon u'mechir chelef avodaschem. What was the purpose of the reparations? The purpose of the reparations is to give you money, payment basically, in exchange for your work. Meaning, think about all the years of slavery in Egypt, right? We worked for free, we were slave laborers. Think about all of the hundreds of years that African Americans worked for free. They were forced to work. Think about the minimum wage that they should have received. Even if you think about minimum wage, all of those slaves, 1 million slaves approximately, over hundreds of years, what would be the number? That's one way to think about reparations. It's actually payment for the work that they've done. Okay, now we continue. That's one idea of what reparations would be about. Another idea is from Bachia ben Asher, it's a 13th century Spanish source. And he says something very, very interesting. He says, and again, this is not dispositive. This is not going to be a proof. Because we have this text, therefore we should do reparations or not. Just different ways to think about what reparations might be about. So he says, Hane Tanik Lo. The question is, what is the language of the mitzvah of ha'anaka, of giving reparations, of giving a gift, is from the word ha'anik. So the question is, what is the source? What does this word actually mean? So anak could mean one of two things. One interpretation, which he says is his second interpretation, it's related to the anakim, the giants, which means that when the slave leaves, you have to make the slave not only whole, but bigger than the slave was materially. You have to help them out. So now they can go with their 40 acres and their mule, right? And they can actually build themselves up. That's one interpretation of the word anak. So it's not necessarily about payment for the past. It's about the future, right? It's about enabling them to be able to have a future, which makes a lot of sense. But there's another interpretation that Bachia ben Asher says. He says, here it is. He says, Lashon Tiferes. The language of ha'anik is really the language of making something beautiful. Klomar aselo kavod v'tiferes mimonecha. Give him a status of honor and glory from your money. Milashon, based on a verse from Proverbs, from Mishlei, that says, Ve'anokim legargarosecha, which means they should be a necklace for your neck, jewelry, meaning the idea of reparations here, at least the Hebrew, is related to the word for jewelry. And it's the idea that when the slave goes out and he has so lost his human dignity, being a slave for you for all of those years, now when the slave leaves, you have to restore the dignity. And one of the ways that you restore the dignity is basically by giving the person reparations so that they have some sense of dignity. We're comparing the reparations now to a piece of jewelry which would adorn the slave. It's another idea. It's about the dignity. It's about, if you will, the recognition of what they went through and their basic humanity. I think this is a very important source because a big part of reparations, according to all theories of reparations, is that along with reparations has to come a sense of reckoning for the sin, for what actually happened, for the crime that happened, for the fact that African Americans, Blacks were not, inferior in any way, God forbid, and we are coming to terms with that, right? And this is another idea. By the way, as I'm talking about this, I just want to, of course, just put it out there. The idea of reparations should not be strange to Jews. As we all know, after the Holocaust in 1952, Germany wanted to begin some reconciliation process with the state of Israel, right? And there were major debates in Israel about whether Israel should receive reparations from Germany. As you know, Menachem Begin was very against it, and David Ben-Gurion was in favor of it. And many historians and scholars say the state of Israel would be nothing close to what it is right now in terms of its strength, in terms of its economic strength, had it not been for those reparations. Now, obviously, the reparations were paid not directly to the survivors. Well, they were also paid directly to the survivors, but in terms of the money that went to the state of Israel, it benefited the people themselves who were in the concentration camps, who were the survivors of the Holocaust. But it's very interesting because in Judaism, the debate about reparations was about whether we should accept it. There was a very, very strong debate. So Menachem Begin, for instance, was so opposed to it, he considered it to be like blood money, basically, because he felt like it would whitewash the sins of the Nazis, if you will, if we accepted the reparations. And that by the way, does come up in certain arguments also about reparations for slavery. I was reading a little bit about this. Menachem Begin, he led a protest which actually turned quite violent. You know, in the Jewish community, we're always very nervous. You know, a lot of us are in the suburbs. Whenever a protest turns violent, or whenever there are any kinds of looting, or this happened in Israel with Menachem Begin. There were many police officers who were injured as a result of the protests against receiving reparations. That's what the protest was about. And Menachem Begin said, apparently, I don't know if it was true or not, but apparently Menachem Begin claimed that the tear gas that they used to gas the protesters, that Israel used, was tear gas from Germany. And he said, you're using the same gas that gassed our parents, you're using it on us. I mean, you can imagine that the tensions were very, very high in Israel. And I think it passed actually by only one vote in the Knesset, only by one vote. And they accepted it. And so obviously we as Jews, you know, individually, a lot of Holocaust survivors around the world, and Israel specifically, would not be, according to many historians, would not be the state it is in terms of its economic strength had it not been for reparations. But part of the reparations is this recognition, you know, it's this recognition that they've committed this crime, that they've done this, and that's part of it. So I think that that's a little bit about what Bachia is saying. Okay, so I want to go on with some of the sources, because again, what this does is it really starts getting into some of the questions that actually were raised by both Coates and Coleman. I just want to stop for a second because I do see no one's unmuting themselves and asking questions, but I do see that there are some questions here in the side. Let me see if I can actually address them in any way. So I see here, okay, that was just a source. But Warren says, except that the Israelites who were themselves slaves received payment for their years of slavery. Their descendants did not receive anything. Right, that's part of the question. Although we will see a source from the Gemara a little bit later on, where there's going to be a rabbi or a person in the Talmud who's going to claim, look, we're owed all this back money. It doesn't end up happening, but there is a claim that's made. And this is 1,000 years later, where there's an argument that's made. But you're absolutely right, Warren. That is definitely one of the big issues that we're discussing. Debbie Fish says, oh, I guess that's the Rambam. When the Rambam said, look here at the slave, that was like, okay, I guess definitely on Seder night, that oftentimes unfortunately happens to a lot of women or men who have actually prepared and gotten everything ready for the Seder. Sarah says, Noah and Ham were cursed to be slaves, which was used by ministers and rabbis to prove that slavery was okay and was from God. We will talk about this. It's really not clear from the text what happened there with the curse of Ham. But yes, that text has been used. Interestingly enough, I was reading that there is no Jewish source that actually makes that claim until the 12th or 13th century. At least what I read is that the idea, the explicit connection between the children of Ham and slavery, and specifically connecting that to people who are Black, that was actually only came in from Muslim scholars who were interpreting the Torah in that way, because in the Islamic world there was slavery, and they were using it. And then the later rabbis, we adopted that. You know, it's funny which things we adopt from other religions or not. So we were very quick to adopt that for some reason. But we might talk about that if we actually get to having a session on slavery itself. Chad says, fine, this appears to be talking about providing reparations to the slave when they were set free. That's not what modern day reparations is addressing. The individuals who want reparations today are not slaves. They're not immediate descendants of slaves. They are just decades and decades, right? That was essentially Coleman Hughes' argument, of course. And that's, you're absolutely right. But we're going to get to some of those questions and some of the sources. I thought the German reparation request was for possessions of jewelry, not the horrible. Okay, so all right, there are a lot of nuances there. It's not the exact topic, so I'm not going to get into that. Right, that's what Dan says. Right, V'gam Yerasha. This is what Ben Gurion quoted the verse that says, in favor of reparations, they murdered us, and now they're also going to take our money, meaning if they murdered us, you know, we shouldn't also be losing our money. Okay, at least should we find that they have artwork stolen? All right, I don't have an answer. Okay, so a lot of good points on the side. I don't know if it's worthwhile for me always to go to all the comments there, but a lot of good questions are coming up, and a lot of those things are going to come up in the sources right now. So now let's take a look at the Gemara. How does the Gemara understand this particular source of the mitzvah of ha'anaka? So the Gemara in source number 5 says, this is the Gemara from Bava Metzia, 31b, says, ha'anek ta'anik. This is the mitzvah that when you let your slave go, you have to actually give the slave gifts. So now this is interesting. I only know from this verse, because the pasuk actually said that the pasuk actually said you have to give him gifts. Asher beirachecha Hashem elokecha, because God has blessed you, you should give him. The implication might be that the only time you actually have to give gifts to your slave is if on account of your slave, you actually materially prospered from your slave's work. But let's say it didn't work out that way. You might think you do not. So the verse says ha'anek ta'anik, which means you have to do it under all circumstances. So I just thought that was an interesting argument, because one of the arguments in favor of reparations, and Coates spoke about this, and almost every person who I've read who talks in favor of reparations makes the argument that the country itself, right, a huge portion of the economy back in the 1800s, before the Emancipation Proclamation, before the Civil War, so much of our economy was built up because of slavery, and the country continued to reap the benefits. So all prosperity, or much prosperity in America, goes back to slavery. We are still benefiting. So the country is still benefiting from it. Therefore, we owe a certain debt towards the former slave. That's like part of the argument in some people's articulation of the idea of reparations. And I just thought that was interesting, because the Gemara itself recognizes that the idea that the slave has given the master so much, that might be a reason to actually do it. In fact, the Gemara says, even if the master feels like he or she has not benefited from the slave, they would still have to do the mitzvah of ha'anaka. Another interesting question that comes up is, here, let's skip down to this source number 5. The Gemara says, "My tama de tanakama de amar mocher atzmo ein ma'anikin lo." There's an opinion that says that the only time that you actually give these reparations or these gifts after the slavery is over is only in the situation where the Beis Din, where the court sold the person into slavery. Now, in the ancient world, the way that it would work is, if, let's say, somebody stole something, and then they couldn't pay it back, the Beis Din, the court, would sell them into slavery. So there's an opinion that the only time that you actually have to pay the reparations if it's in that situation. Let's say a person would sell himself into slavery, then there perhaps would not be reparation. And the Gemara goes back on that question itself. But here's the question that a number of people have brought up, Warren and Chad, and Mitch McConnell and Coleman Hughes. Lots of people have brought up this question. The idach, listen to this. Hahumi v'ile lo v'lo liyarshav. The other rabbi in the Gemara uses the text that says ha'aneg ta'anik lo. You should give gifts to that person. The implication being that there are other people, other kinds of slaves, who would not receive gifts. Who are the other people who would not receive gifts? Hahumi v'ile lo v'lo liyarshav. That what? The only person who would receive these gifts would only be the slave, him or herself, not descendants of slaves. So first of all, interesting that in terms of the reparations that we received from Germany, from the claims conference, the ones that went directly to families, it did go to descendants, but it only went to children. I don't think it went to grandchildren or great-grandchildren. I think it ended after one generation. But there was a sense of yorshim, even though the children were not directly there. So, either we can object to the fact that many Jews have received these payments, or the idea of limiting it specifically to the slaves themselves, the question is, why would you say that? If they're children, because of the slavery of their parents. I mean, let's think about it with Judaism. The kids came, their parents were in the Holocaust. Their parents would have had all of this wealth or money, or some level of money from before the Holocaust. They lost all of it. They had to go through everything in the Holocaust. You can make the argument that now the children should get it if the parents are no longer here. The children are still suffering from what their parents experienced. But the bottom line is, the Gemara, in one opinion here, or at least entertains the idea that it should only be for the slave, him or herself, and not for the yarshim. But then the Gemara says, am I low? Why would you say that the gift only goes to the slaves and not to the heirs? But schir kaya rachmana, the Torah refers to this kind of slave. Again, we're talking about an eved ivri as a sechir. A sechir is a hired worker. Now, ma schir pulas of the yarshav, af hai pulas of the yarshav. Let's say somebody works for you and then they die before they get their payment. They work a very hard day and then they die. What's the halacha? Do you have to pay their descendants? Absolutely, you have to pay their descendants. So what the Gemara says is, if somebody worked very, very hard and they didn't get paid and then they died, you have to pay their descendants. Same thing with slaves. The slaves did not get paid, you have to pay their descendants. And there's no indication that this idea stops after one generation. And this is where the Gemara ends. And the Gemara then says, you know what the word lo is coming to exclude? It's saying only the slave or the slave's descendants, the lo lebal chovo, which means, let's say the slave owes somebody else $50,000. And now you set the slave free. You know what that money, that reparations money cannot do? It can't go to pay off other obligations that the slave has. It has to go to the slave. But does it have to go to the slave? Can it also go to the slave's descendants? According to this text, according to this Gemara, it would also go to the descendants. And if you think about it, again, I guess this really gets to the question. I mean, Chad and Warren and Coleman Hughes and many people, they make this argument. But if you say that all of the slaves deserved 40 acres and a mule, they deserve some reparations. It did not happen. And now generations later, you can get into the question of, how are we going to do the genealogical research? How will people prove that they're descendants of slaves? But let's say you have someone before you who is clearly a descendant of a slave. They did all of this forced labor for free. They were never paid. In addition to the labor, all of the oppression, all that stuff. We don't even get into all that. And they deserved to have reparations at the end. Everybody agrees. So why would you say that that does not continue after generations? Now, what you could say, and I think actually Coleman Hughes was more going in the direction of, is it a good idea? Is it going to lead to more division in the country? Is that really what, the slaves, what even all people who are Black want? Because maybe it will turn them into victims. That's what Coleman Hughes was saying. But the basic obligation of paying them back, the question is, why does that end? And you can say, who has the obligation to pay? We don't have the slave owners anymore. Does that devolve onto the country because the country allowed it to happen? I mean, all those questions are up, but it is very interesting that the idea that the slaves are no longer here, that does actually seem to be rejected in the Gemara. Again, I'm not saying that you can go directly from this source in Kedushin, page 15a, and say we have a direct proof from that source that we should. I'm just saying the Gemara does entertain and seem to have the idea that you would pay future generations. Again, you can say this is only talking about an Eved Ivri, it's only talking about a Jewish slave, not a non-Jewish slave, but as a general framing of the issue, I think it is very interesting. All right, we go on. The Gemara now, I have a source, this is the Torah Tamima, quoting the Gemara, and this is actually very interesting in terms of the question of, let's say you accept the idea that there should be reparations. How should they be paid? So some people say it should be cash, This is what we owe them, this is what we should have given them all right away, and now we should give it to them now. Others say, no, the money should go towards supporting educational initiatives for African Americans. It should go towards scholarships for universities. It should go to other kinds of things, but not necessarily a direct cash payment. But so interesting that the Torah Tamima says, he quotes this Gemara, I'm not going to read it inside, but basically the Gemara says in the text, it actually says that what you give him, you give the slave from your flock, from your threshing floor, your vat. You give him things that he can go ahead and plant more. You give him things, you give the slave things that they can take from what you're giving and turn it into greater wealth. That's the idea. And we learn from there, Yatsu Ksafim. At least one opinion in the Gemara says you're not allowed to give the slave reparations of cash. It can't be a cash payment. Or v'huadim begadim, it can't be clothes because you just wear the clothes and they're gone. You have to give him animals that could then produce more animals, or different kinds of things that you can go ahead and plant and make yourself an orchard or make yourself a wheat field. It has to be the kind of thing that can actually provide lasting wealth or growing economic means for the slave. I think that's a very interesting question. There's a different opinion. The Torah Tamima says, you know what? V'yesh b'gemara deot shonot. The Gemara has other opinions too. But I just think that these are interesting questions, fascinating, that the rabbis are actually discussing. Okay, I'm going to shift gears here. Right? Up until now, we've been talking about the mitzvah of ha'anaka, which is a very specific mitzvah. You have a slave. The slave goes out after 6 years. Of course, the context really technically is talking about an Eved Ivri, a Jewish slave, and you have to do this mitzvah of ha'anaka. We have all these discussions. What's the purpose of it? What's the idea behind it? Is it to pay them back for their lost wages? Is it about giving them a sense of dignity, like almost like a necklace around their neck, or a sense of their human worth? Now, when you do give them the money, how do you do it? Can you give it to the Yorshim? Can you give it to their inheritors? Yes, but who can you not give it to? You cannot give it to Ba'alei Chov. You can't give it to people who are their debtors. By the way, interesting discussion. One of the things that I heard, actually, one of the people who I've read so much and I listened to so much, I don't remember who said this, but within those who support reparations, there's a strong voice that says it should not be cash payments. And the concern is that as long as so many African Americans don't have land, don't have property, don't have the means to actually transform that cash into generational wealth, what will end up happening is that money will just end up being a stimulus for the whole economy, and all of that cash will just be spent, and it'll end up actually making the wealth gap between the races actually wider, right? And there's a concern about cash. I'm not saying, I understand the argument that maybe it should be cash. Let the descendants of slaves, they had never been paid back for all of their work. If you say that they're owed the money, they should be paid the money, and that's none of our business how they're going to use the money. That's their money to use it how they want to use it. But it's just an interesting question. Anyways, that's what we've done until now. Now we're going to go to a different section, which we're going to look at the historical example of the Jewish people being slaves, and what do we see in terms of reparations in that particular thing. But I'm going to pause here. I'll give you a second. If anyone wants to either unmute yourself, have any questions up until now, any points or angles or aspects that you think I'm leaving out that we should bring to the table, because I definitely have a lot of information that's not necessarily here on the source sheet, but I just want to pause here for a minute because I've been talking a lot. You can either write a question in the comments or you can unmute yourself. I'm happy to answer any question. Okay, well, then I will continue with the source sheet. And this, I think, is very significant. One of the things that I think is very interesting, as we go back and we look at the actual case of the Jewish people, of course, it's like 1/5 of the Torah, the book of Shemos, and it really goes back to Bereshis as well, the idea that we were actually slaves in Egypt. One thing that I find very interesting, this idea of, let's say, like, for instance, the notion that, well, the slaves, they're no longer here. Now we have maybe descendants of slaves, but they weren't actually enslaved. They weren't actually enslaved. Just want to throw out an idea, just as a framing idea. You know, we think every year at the Pesach Seder, what do we say at the very end of Magid? Very end of Magid, what do we say? Chayav Adam liros es atzmo ki'ilu hu yatsa mimitzrayim. That each and every individual at the Seder, what do they have to imagine? They have to see as if they left Egypt. When we eat the matzah, what are we supposed to do? We're supposed to transport ourselves and feel as if we are going free. When we eat the maror, we're supposed to remember that we were there. As Jews, we have great imaginations. You know, we always use this idea that actually descendants were there in a certain way. You know, if you read the book of Devarim, over and over again, the Torah says that you were at Chorev, you were at Har Sinai. So you could say it's only talking to the next generation, the generation that was going to the land of Israel. But it's very clear that what the Torah is trying to make us feel as that all of us, you know, when we celebrate Shavuot, that we are there. So this idea that future generations were not directly impacted. I understand the argument that's being made from a technical legal perspective, but I just want to put out there the idea that when we talk about slavery in Egypt, oftentimes we try to feel as if that's something that we personally experienced. Again, that doesn't necessarily have legal weight, but I think it's a very significant argument, and it's something for us to think about as we oftentimes can have judgments about the idea that maybe, this person never experienced a day of slavery in his life. That's true, but we feel like we did experience slavery because we feel like we left Egypt and we experienced slavery. We try to reenact that every single year at the Seder. I don't know how seriously we take it, but it's just an interesting idea. But anyways, the next source I think is very, very interesting, because what it says is that built into the experience of the Jewish people going into Egypt and being slaves, reparations are built into that experience. This is a pasuk, Reparations chapter 15, from the Bris Ben Absarim, the covenant of the parts, where Hashem comes to Avram and says, Avram, I know you're childless now. This is even before Yishmael was born. Avram had no children. And Avram's basically like, Hashem, look, what are you giving me? I don't have any children. The whole thing, the whole idea, the whole promise, right? But I don't have any children right now. What's the big deal? So Hashem says, look, you're going to have kids. You have to know that your children are going to be foreigners in a land that's not them. They are going to be enslaved. They are going to be oppressed. Arba meo shana, for 400 years. But what will happen? Gam es hagoy asher yavdu dan anochi. First of all, the nation that they serve, i.e. the Egyptians, I'm going to hold them accountable. Accountability for the sin. But then afterwards, they're going to go out with great wealth. This is amazing. This is before the slavery even started, hundreds of years before. Hashem tells Avram, look, your children are going to go into slavery, but there are going to be two components when it ends. Number one, the oppressors are going to have to be taken to task. They're going to be judged, right? That's part of reparations, is to sort of confess the sin, if you will, okay, to apologize for the sin. And then the second piece is they're going to go out with great wealth. It's very interesting that built into the promise of them going in is the idea that they're going to actually go out with great wealth. I'm going to skip the source number 8. Maybe we'll get back to it. It's a very, very interesting source, but I don't have enough time to go into it right now. So we're going to skip it right now. The next few sources, after I posted that I was teaching this class, and some people directed me to Rabbi Aryeh Bernstein, who I actually knew back in Chovevei, my first year there. He was there. He wasn't a student, but he used to come and learn there sometimes. Anyway, so he's done a lot of research on the issue of reparations and Judaism. He wrote a wonderful article about it and gave a series of classes, and I've been in contact with him, and he shared some of his sources with me. So a lot of the following sources are going to actually come from some of his texts. So I just, the translations are his as well. So I just definitely want to recognize that. But anyways, as now the Jewish people go through the slavery, Hashem, this next source number 9, is actually at the burning bush. Hashem appears to Moshe and says, I want you to go and tell Pharaoh, Shalach et ami, send out my people, let them go free. And what it says is, when you go out, v'hayaki telechun lo telchu rekam, don't go out empty-handed. That verse should sound very familiar, because back to the mitzvah of Hanukkah, let me just scroll up. What does it say over here? It says, lo tishalchenu rekam. When you send out your slave, don't send him out empty-handed. Well, guess what? When Hashem is speaking to Moshe at the burning bush, Hashem says, when you go out, do not go out empty-handed. Every woman should, now there's a question about what this word means. Does it mean ask, that they should ask for these things, for silver and gold and different clothes, and you'll put them, v'nitzaltem es Mitzrayim, you're going to clean out Egypt. Basically, Hashem says, when you leave, you're going to clean out Egypt. The question is, so what does the word sha'al mean? Does it mean lish'al, meaning you ask if you could have it? And the Egyptians will just, out of the goodness of their heart, or maybe because they were very scared because of all the plagues that were happening at the time, they're just going to give you all these things, and that will be basically your reparations. Or does it mean, and this is going to come up in some rabbinic sources a little later on, from the word she'ela, which means to borrow. Lish'ol is to borrow also. So maybe the Jewish people said to the Egyptians, hey, can we borrow this? Because remember, when they said that they were going out, they just said they were going out for a few days to do a chag la Hashem. They were just going to do some service to God. And maybe they just were borrowing it and then they never paid back. We're going to see that's going to come up in a Gemara. But the bottom line is either way, they cleaned out Egypt on their way out. They took everything. They didn't just take 40 acres and a mule. They basically took everything. They wiped out Egypt of everything. Okay. Now, it was a little easier for them because instead of having Abraham Lincoln on their side, who didn't have as much power, they had God on their side. And God basically made all the Egyptians drown in the sea, and they were able to take whatever they wanted to take. And also before they left, they were able to take all of these things, and there were plagues going on. Obviously, the Jewish freedom from slavery in Egypt happened in a very different way than African-American slavery ended in America. So consequently, they got a lot more than the 40 acres and a mule. They got much more than that. They got everything they needed. They got tremendous sense of wealth. Actually, the commentaries say, what happened with all that money? They might have built the Mishkan with it. We know, by the way, they did the Egel with it. Sometimes when you get money for reparations, you might actually not do the right thing with it. You know, they might have actually used it for the Egel. Clearly, they used some of that money for the Egel Hazav, for the golden calf. But they also, according to the commentaries, used a lot of that money in order to build the Mishkan. And then, in order to be able to make it through 40 years in the desert. It was very, very important, very significant. Anyways, what actually happens in source number 10, speak to the people. Hashem will give the chen ha'am be'enei Mitzrayim. Hashem will give the grace of the people in the eyes of Egypt. They'll give you all the money you want, and you're going to leave. Again, I'm not going to jump into Rabbeinu Chananel. We're running out of time here. But Rabbeinu Chananel, this source, by the way, I'll share the source. And if anyone wants a copy of the source sheet, just email me. I would put it in the chat box, but I know every time I try to put my source sheet in the chat box, for some reason it doesn't work. So anyways, if you want the source sheet, please email me. I'm happy to send it to you. But this source, Rabbeinu Chananel, basically goes out of its way to say, look, they didn't ein she'ela zu k'she'ela hamur b'kelim. This does not mean that they borrowed it, because then there would be the argument that they have to pay back. But rather they just ask, can we please have all these things as reparations? We worked for you for all these years. Please pay us back. And that's exactly what happened. And then they actually left, and on their way back, it did in fact happen, and they got all that money. This verse just confirms that that's exactly what happened. Now, what's very interesting is that when the Jewish people are about to leave, the text says, Daber na ba'aznei ha'am. Hashem says to Moshe, please speak to the people. I beg of you that they should go to the Egyptians and take their reparations, take their money. Please, I beg of you that it happen. So the Gemara says, this is from Brachos 9a. The Gemara says as follows: Amri dvei Yanai, ein na elo lashon bakasha. Na means please. Hashem is asking, Hashem is begging the people to please take the money. Why does Hashem have to beg the people? So the Gemara plays this out. Amri HaKadosh Baruch Hu Moshe, bivakasha mimcha, lech ve'emor lehem Yisrael. Please, Moshe, go tell the Jewish people, bivakasha mikem, that I, Hashem, I'm begging you, I'm asking you, please, shalom Mitzrayim k'kasef, go borrow the things, go ask for the Egypt to take the things. I want you to please take the things out. Why? Why did Hashem care about this so much? Shlo Yomar Oso Tzadik, that pious person, Avraham, who Hashem promised to Avram at the covenant of the parts, that what will happen? You're going to go into Egypt, your kids will be slaves there, your descendants will be slaves, but afterwards, Avram's going to say, look, the first half of the promise of slavery, Hashem, you did a good job with that one. You fulfilled that very well. They went through terrible slavery. They suffered so much. But then the final part of the promise, that they're going to go out with great wealth, that you didn't do a good job fulfilling. So Amru Lo, so then when Moshe goes to the people and says, hey, you got to take reparations. What did they say back? They said, look, we don't want the reparations. We don't want the money. We just want to get out of here. Well, what do you mean we should go? Our only desire right now is to leave. Mashal Adam, and then they give a parable that someone is in Beis Hasurim, they're in jail, and they tell people, look, tomorrow you're going to be able to go free, and you're going to get a lot of money. So they say, look, please, just let me go out. Don't give me any of the money. I don't need the money. I just want to get out of here. But the bottom line is Hashem did not let that happen. because Hashem knew that they would need the money. You can't just be set free and have no financial means and then expect a better outcome, you know? And of course, we know what happened after slavery, after 1865, after the 1863 Emancipation Proclamation, 1865, all the slaves are set free. And what happened within just a few years, since they did not have their 40 acres and a mule, they all became, many of them became sharecroppers to the same people who they were slaves to just 10 years before. And essentially, basically, the slavery and the poverty went on in a deep way. And then you had Jim Crow and you had redlining and all the other things that happened. One thing happened after the other. So the idea is Hashem says to the people, it's not your choice. You have to take it. If I'm going to fulfill my promise to to Avraham, I can't just promise that you're going to go into slavery and then you're going to go free, because you might be free, but you're not going to have the means to actually go and live a dignified life. So you're required to take the money. Very, very interesting idea. Okay, I'm basically running out of time, but I do want to point to one more source, very interesting source from the Gemara. It relates to some of the comments that were raised. I just want to read. I just see James says, museums should return stolen goods. The whole U.S. was built by slaves. Okay, this is part of the argument, of course, for reparations. Chad says, Pesach, yes, and we use that to improve our situation, to strive, to achieve, and become more. We don't look for reparations. Obviously, I'm using that as a concept, as an idea that we have this notion that we do see ourselves in that way. Actually, this does speak. I didn't mention it before, but the Rabbeinu B'chaya from before that I skipped actually refers to va'achar chen yetzu b'chosh gadol. Afterwards, you're going to go out with great wealth. The question is, why is this so important that they're going to go out with great wealth? So we have reasons, and this Gemara that we just quoted seems to say, look, this is what's going to actually enable them to go on with their life and make something from themselves after they go free. But Rabbeinu B'chai says it actually is referring to spiritual rechosh. It's actually referring to their neshama, to their soul. In other words, the idea is after they're slaves for all those years, they're going to be able to look back on their years in slavery, as hard as they were. And those years in slavery are going to make the people, because it actually turns us into a people that always remembers that we were slaves in Egypt because we were there. And now we know how to treat the widow and the orphan and the people who are vulnerable, the people who are disadvantaged. That's why we have 36 times in the Torah. Remember that you were a foreigner, a stranger in the land of Egypt. In other words, there are other ideas as well. And that might be part of, if you will, the rechush gadol, the great thing that you were able to take out of it. But anyways, here's this last Gemara. Here's this last Gemara, then we'll get to Lou's question after the Gemara, but I just want to do this Gemara here. I'm just going to read it in English just to save time. So another time, Egyptians came for judgment with Israel before Alexander. They said to him, it says, and Hashem gave the people favor in the sight of Egyptians, and they lent to them. So the Egyptians look back at the Torah. These are Egyptians during the 2nd century, let's say BCE. And they look back at the Torah and they interpret the word sha'al as in they borrowed. The Jews borrowed all of that money, but did they ever pay it back? No, they didn't go back after they left and said, here's your stuff back. They just took it through the desert and went into Israel. So basically what the Egyptians are saying is, give us the silver and gold that you took for us, meaning they demanded at this point, this is now, 1,000 years later, 1,100 years later, they demanded that they get repaid for the gold and the silver. They went to Alexander, the king, who was the emperor of the Jews and the Egyptians at that time, and said, look, the Jews owe us all of this money. So Gvia ben Psia said to the sages, give me permission and I'm going to go argue the case with them before Alexander. If they defeat me, then you can say you defeated one of our civilians. Basically, Gvia, I don't think he was a rabbi. He basically said, look, if I lose the debate, you can just say, oh, he was one of our commoners. You don't have to worry about him. But if I defeat them, then you can say the Torah of Moshe, our rabbi, has defeated you. Let me see if I can come up with an argument against the Egyptians who are basically saying that we owe them money. Why do we owe them money? We were the slaves. Why do we owe them money? We owe them money because we took their gold and silver and didn't pay it back. So the rabbis gave him permission. He went and he argued with them. He said to them, from where do you bring evidence? Meaning, what is your evidence that we took the money? So they said from the Torah. The Torah said that we borrowed the stuff from them. So he said to them, I too will bring you evidence only from the Torah. So this is what Gvia said, as it says, and the Israelites which they resided in Egypt for 430 years. Basically, we were slaves for you for 430 years. Give us payment for the labor of 600,000. We know there were 600,000 men. You should really say 2 million because there were, if you add the women and the children, whom you enslaved in Egypt for 430 years. So basically, it's like, if you really want to go, you want to play this game? You want to go back to the Torah because the Torah says that we borrowed things and didn't pay you back? Well, what else does the Torah say? The Torah says that you enslaved us for 400 years, 430 years. And not only that, we had 600,000 laborers. So you had free laborers for 600,000 years, minimum wage, 2 million people, 430 years. Let's figure out what the number is. So Alexander said to them, give them an answer. They said to him, give us 3 days. He gave them time. They investigated it and found no answer. Immediately they left their fields and their planted vines had fled, and that year was a sabbatical. So obviously you can say that this was just a retort. This was just an argument getting out of the fact that the Egyptians were trying to claim money from them. So this was their very smart retort, if you will. But essentially, and people do, use this as a source, it's essentially what they're saying is that fundamentally, you still owe us money. This is 1,000 years later. You still owe us money. You still owe us money for 430 years. We never got paid. And so obviously this source or the idea behind it could be that if there's a debt that's owed, we said before in the Gemara, it's lo uli yorshav. It applies also to the descendants. Now, again, the argument could, and that actually does make sense to me. I mean, the idea that someone the idea that America, in my opinion, did a tremendously immoral and terrible thing by forget about slavery. Then they did not end up actually giving them the reparations at that time. The idea that that obligation just falls away, I don't understand how that would happen. I mean, I do understand some of the other arguments. Is it worthwhile? Is it going to create even more division in the country? Is it financially feasible? Will it cause the whole country to collapse? These are other questions for economists to ask. These are very, very valid questions. I don't necessarily have answers to all those questions. Obviously, I have opinions about them. But here we have just like a lot of different sources, a lot of ideas back and forth. Nothing definitive. But what's clear is, obviously, these sources tell us, this is something that's mentioned in the Torah and over and over again. We were slaves in Egypt. I'm going to just stop the share for a second. We were slaves in Egypt. We have to remember what that was like. That gives us responsibilities. The basic notion of reparations, the idea that they are owed money, slaves are owed money, is clearly there from the Torah. The question that's debated, I don't think you're going to get a clear answer from. The question of how would that apply so many years later? Is it worthwhile? How are you going to do the payments? If you do the payments, shouldn't we? Another big argument that's made is, well, there are also people who are not African American who are equally poor. Shouldn't they be assisted? And I said the baby bonds approach of Senator Cory Booker sort of addresses that. But all those questions are very, very complicated questions. I don't think you're going to get specific answers from Torah text to those questions. But the basic values you have, there's still room, in my opinion, for the full gamut, for both Coleman's views, for Coates's views, for everyone here. And I'm looking at the people, I know people here really span the gamut here, but I actually think that you can find the idea in the text. You can find different ideas in the text. It's very, very hard. But for me, it's the idea of taking some of these ideas, of engaging them seriously, of trying to learn them with our own sources. There certainly are values to be learned from learning our sources, even if we can't necessarily come to a very specific conclusion. So I'm going to open it up for questions again. I think that before Lou Essers said he had some questions, but he didn't put them down in the chat. So I don't know if that meant that you want to actually ask them. Feel free to unmute yourself or anyone else.
Hi, Rabbi.
Yes. Hey, Lou.
Hi. Yeah, I'm just struggling with the notion that reparations, I've always thought of reparations as a voluntary payment for wrong. So I'm trying to see the congruence with that notion and the idea that the Jews took what they could from the Egyptians, and as you have described that. So that's the one question.
Well, I mean, I would say that why would we necessarily say that it's voluntary? Like we had one source, one of
reparation. My point is that if we're using the term reparations, though, that to my knowledge, is a kind of a technical way of saying we're paying for, voluntarily paying for a wrong, as what happened after the Second World War.
Are you saying because Germany could have decided not to do that? I mean,
No, I'm saying why use the Jews leaving Egypt having been slaves and calling that reparations when it actually is not. It's the taking of trying to right a wrong by taking, whereas reparations in the Second World War were a voluntary payment.
okay. I mean, I don't know enough about the term reparations, the actual word and its legal definition to speak to that. So call it something else, whatever you want to call it. The point is that we do have. You can say that you can make the same argument that the idea of the slaves themselves never received whatever it would be. You can say payment for all of their work or whatever wrong happened to them.
Well,
so whatever word you want to use.
So and my other question is, I thought that you said that children got reparations after the war. I thought the only children that were entitled to reparations were those who were in Germany and who were in work camps, but the descendants of, do you understand what I'm saying?
Yes, I mean, I just looked. I mean, I'm not obviously an expert or particularly knowledgeable about this, but I did just look it up before the class, and they said, and at least what the source that I looked up said that they did give it. It was actually an article from Stuart Eisenstadt. He was one of the chief negotiators for the claims conference, and he said that he actually was opposed to reparations in the context of the descendants of the slaves, because he basically said that the distinction was that when it came to the reparations in Germany, it was only the next generation. He did say that. Maybe I misread it, so I'm not sure, but I'm not sure.
Well, thanks for a very interesting evening, Rabbi.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Any other last questions or comments?
Rabbi, this is Elliot. If I can ask one question or ask you to just comment on something. As you're going through some of these sources, I was thinking about whether they give us a lens into how to think about the idea of affirmative action. Sort of, I know that's another huge topic, but it seemed to me that some of the sources, that speak to not necessarily just giving money, but giving something to improve status or give somebody an opportunity for the future, not just pay them back for something.
Right.
So I wonder if you have any comments about whether that sort of gives us some way of looking at affirmative action.
I mean, I definitely think that some of the sources, especially around the concept of ha'anaka, and also some of the sources around what the Jewish people might have done with that money. If you say that they built the Mishkan with that, and the Mishkan is basically, the place where the Kohanim and Levim, they're not only there to do the ritual sacrifices, they're also there to educate the people. And, there's a lot more. It's the center. So you can sort of start thinking about the money that was used to be used in other ways, instead of it just being a cash payment, but it's actually being used in a way to enhance and set up the next generation. I think that you definitely do have that in the sources. Again, nothing is a direct proof. Oh, we can look at that text and see this, but I think that some of the basic ideas behind it are certainly there. Okay.
Rabbi?
Yes.
Elaine Snyder here. So I have a question, and it refers to what happened before Alexander, Egypt's appeal. Are there any other sources that refer to that? Either Jewish or non-Jewish?
I don't think so. But perhaps, I don't know. I didn't do a lot of research. Again, that source was on this Rabbi Aryeh Bernstein's source sheet. It's a source that I was familiar with before. I'm not sure if there are. It's interesting, in that particular Gemara, you don't only have the Egyptians coming, you also have the descendants of Yishmael coming, and they have a grievance against the Jews. The descendants of Ham actually come, and they have a grievance against the Jews. And you have similar Gemaras, but obviously the one about the Egyptians was most relevant to us. So we're gonna end the class over here. Next week, I think we're gonna talk about the topic of another not controversial, very, very, very uncontroversial topic, all about policing, role of police. According to halakha, what is the role of police? What are they supposed to do? How are police how are they held liable for things that they do that are wrong? You know, again, this is a very complicated thing. I want to underscore the fact that I'm just doing research on my own right now. I'm not an expert in any kind of way on any of these topics, certainly from a legal perspective or a secular perspective. I'm just trying to think through some issues that we're encountering in the news, and I'm trying to see them through our traditional sources to try to engage in some of the most important issues that we're dealing with through the Torah, through halacha, through our understanding. So looking forward to seeing you all here next Tuesday night at 8 o'clock. Have a great night. Thank you.